like Portuguese, the key is learning the systematic patterns that connect them and the predictable places where they diverge. That's what this video is about. Before we begin, I want to make something clear. In this video, I'm focusing specifically on Brazilian Portuguese, not European Portuguese. And that's intentional. The reason is phonetics, above all else. Brazilian Portuguese has a sound system that, while different from Spanish, still shares enough openness and vowel clarity that Spanish speakers can adjust with training. European Portuguese is another story. It has heavier vowel reduction and more consonant clustering and a rhythm that can feel almost Slavic to Spanish ears. The pronunciation patterns are different enough that they really deserve their own strategy and honestly their own separate video. So in this episode, we're looking at how Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese interact, where they align, where they diverge, and how to systematically use one to learn the other. If there's interest, we can later do a video focusing on European Portuguese because that's a different phonetic universe. To start off, let's look at vocabulary. Same roots, systematic shifts. So first we have regular ending shifts. These are your biggest friend. In other words, one of the biggest advantages is that many differences are mechanical, not random. Once you learn the patterns, you stop memorizing words and start converting them. For example, the CION, Portuguese sound. This is the most famous one. Información, informação, information. Nación, nação, nation. Situación, situação, situation. Educación, educação, education. Producción, produção, production. The pronunciation shifts too. Spanish keeps the clear CION, sion. Portuguese compresses it into a nasal sound, but visually the transformation is extremely regular. Next, we have dad in Spanish and dade in Portuguese. Libertad, liberdade, freedom. Universidad, universidade, university. Realidade, realidade, reality. Ciudad, cidade, city. Again, not random. Just add that final E and adjust the vowel quality, as well as paying attention to how the consonants change sound, soften. Number 3, Spanish, BLE, Portuguese, VEL. Posible, possível, possible. Increíble, increível. This one is especially helpful because these are high frequency words. Number 4, Spanish, ario, ario. Portuguese, ario, contrário, contrário, contrary. Necessário, necessário, necessary. Secretário, secretário, secretary. Often just an accent shift and subtle pronunciation change. Number 5, Spanish, ero, E-R-O, and Portuguese, E-I-R-O. Dinheiro, dinheiro, money. Primeiro, primeiro, enero, janeiro, January. Notice that this pattern is extremely consistent. Once you recognize it, you start seeing it everywhere. Note that the O at the end of Brazilian Portuguese words is pronounced more like a U. Number 6, Spanish INTO and Portuguese ENTO. Here's where Portuguese often looks slightly shorter. Viento, vento, wind. Movimiento, movimento, movement. Pensamiento, pensamento, thought. Portuguese frequently drops the I glide you see in Spanish. This is part of a broader pattern. Portuguese often simplifies diphthongs that Spanish preserves. 7, UE, Portuguese O. Another very productive shift. Bueno, bom. The M is pronounced like an N. Good. Fuerte, forte. Strong. Notice the softening of the T. Forte. Nuevo, novo, new. Spanish loves diphthongs like UE and IE. Portuguese often reduces them to a single vowel. Number 8, IE in Spanish, E in Portuguese. Tiempo, tempo, time, weather. Siempre, sempre, always. Pierna, perna, leg. Cielo, céu, sky. Again, Spanish keeps the diphthong. Portuguese simplifies it. This is why Portuguese words often look slightly shorter, as I mentioned, or visually more compact. Then we have dropped or weakened vowels in Portuguese. Portuguese, especially Brazilian Portuguese, reduces unstressed vowels far more than Spanish does. Spanish keeps vowels clear and stable. Portuguese lets them soften, centralize, or almost disappear. That's why Portuguese looks familiar on paper, but sounds harder at first, especially for Spanish speakers. Then we have DE reduction Portuguese. DE in Brazil is often pronounced like G. Examples: de nada, you're welcome, de nada. De verdade, de verdade, really, truly. De manhã, in the morning. Unstressed TE sounds like chi. Eu te amo. Eu te disse. I told you. Vou te ligar. I'll call you. Spanish keeps the vowel pure. Next, the unstressed E reduces. In many positions, unstressed E becomes something like I, or a very weak vowel. Examples: telefone often sounds like telefone, and like an I at the end. Grande, big. Nome, name. Meu nome é Carlos. My name is Carlos. Spanish would pronounce every vowel fully. Mi nombre es Carlos. Next, let's look at unstressed O. Unstressed O often sounds closer to a U sound. Como, poto, polvo. Eu como muito. I eat a lot. Spanish keeps the vowel open. Yo como mucho. Then we have vowel compression inside words. Portuguese often compresses internal vowels more than Spanish does. Pra for para. Ta for está. Você está aqui. You're here. For você está aqui. Spanish would never reduce this much. Tú estás aquí. Why this matters? Well, on paper, tempo, Spanish tiempo. Vento, Spanish viento. Pensamento, Spanish pensamiento, thought. They look extremely close, but in speech, tempo becomes tempo, vento becomes vento, pensamento becomes pensamento. Unstressed vowels weaken everywhere. So if your brain sees Spanish, but your ears hear something more compact, softer, and rhythmically different, it's more difficult to understand. That's why Spanish speakers usually read Portuguese relatively quickly, but they struggle with listening comprehension at first. And once you train your ears for vowel reduction, Brazilian Portuguese suddenly becomes much more transparent. Next, the final L sounds like U in Brazilian Portuguese. When L appears at the end of a syllable or word, it is usually pronounced like a U sound, almost like an English W at times. Spanish keeps it clearly pronounced. Brazilian Portuguese vocalizes it. For example, the country Brazil, mal for mal in Spanish with the same spelling. Animal for animal, animal in Spanish. Final, final in Spanish, final. Papel, papel in Spanish, paper. Looking at some example sentences, Portuguese, o Brasil é país grande. Brasil es país grande. Brasil es país grande. Brazil is a big country. Another example. Isso é normal. Eso es normal. That is normal. Next, we run into false cognates. Some words look identical and mean completely different things. And these matter because they're common everyday words. They aren't the majority, but when you get them wrong, the misunderstanding is immediate and sometimes embarrassing. For example, in Spanish, embarazada, pregnant. In Portuguese, embarazada, embarrassed, confused. Like in English, embarrassed. This is the classic one. If a Spanish speaker says, estoy embarazada, it means I'm pregnant. Pasta, paste, pasta, folder in Spanish, depending on context. Pasta, folder, briefcase, money in Brazilian Portuguese. In Spain, pasta can mean paste or pasta as in food. Oficina, office in Spanish. Oficina, workshop, repair shop in Portuguese. So while in Spanish, oficina is like in English, office, in Portuguese, it's a mechanical workshop or a repair shop. So if you say in Brazil that you work in an oficina, people may think you repair cars. The correct word for office in Portuguese is escritório. These false friends are dangerous because they look perfectly transparent. They feel safe and they are high frequency words, but they can completely change the meaning. So while most vocabulary differences are systematic and predictable, these need to be memorized consciously early on. Next, let's take a look at pronouns. This is where Brazil goes its own way. This is one of the biggest structural differences between Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese. At first glance, both languages seem to have an informal and a formal you, but the way Brazil actually uses them is very different from Spanish. And if you map them correctly, you'll misunderstand the tone of the sentence. In Spanish, there's a clear distinction. Spanish keeps a clean grammatical contrast. Tú hablas, you speak, informal. Usted habla, you speak, formal. Tú vas, you go, informal. Usted va, you go, formal. The structure is consistent. Tú, second person verb. Usted, third person verb. There's no mixing. The form signals both grammar and social distance. So now let's look at the Brazilian Portuguese system, where você dominates. In most of Brazil, você is the default everyday you. Tu exists regionally. Verb agreement often stays third person. Você fala, you speak. Ela fala, he speaks. So you see the same third person. Same verb form, but socially, você is neutral, not formal. That is the key difference. In other words, você does not equal usted in Brazil. Many Spanish speakers assume that você is equal to usted because both take the third person verbs. Grammatically, that's true. Socially, it's wrong. In Brazil, você quer café? Do you want coffee? The Spanish equivalent tone, quieres café, using the informal, not quiere café, usted. Você is neutral, everyday you. Usted is respectful, formal, the distant you. They are not equivalents. Now let's consider the use of tu in Brazil and the agreement issue. In some regions of Brazil, especially in the south and northeast, people use tu, but there's a twist. Verb agreement is often third person, like it would be for usted and você. Tu vai, you go, instead of tu vais, traditional second person. So you get tu vai amanhã, are you going tomorrow? Ele vai amanhã, is he going tomorrow? Same verb form. To a Spanish speaker, this feels wrong because Spanish requires tu vas, él va, second person informal and third person singular. The distinction must be maintained. Brazil often neutralizes it in speech. Now, let's look at possessives. Another difference. In the Spanish system, tu libro, your book, informal. Usted, su libro, your book, formal. Su being third person singular. Brazilian Portuguese, você, seu livro, third person singular, your book. Tu, teu livro, your book, regional use. But mixing happens. So let's think about what this means for learners. If you are a Spanish speaker learning Brazilian Portuguese, don't treat você like usted. Don't expect second person verb agreement. Expect regional variation. Focus more on the tone than on morphology. If you're a Portuguese speaker learning Spanish, you must use second person verbs with tu. You cannot say tu va. Agreement is grammatically mandatory. This is one of the biggest mindset shifts between the two languages. Now let's take a look at grammar, where structure really diverges. Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese share basic grammar. At the beginner level, they feel very close, but at an intermediate and advanced levels, structural differences begin to shape fluency. This is where similarity becomes deceptive. First, we have the future subjunctive. Portuguese has a future subjunctive. Spanish does not. For example, in Portuguese, quando eu for ao Brasil, eu te ligar. When I go to Brazil, I will call you. Quando eu for here is the subjunctive for to go. Quando eu vou, when I go. Se você fizer isso, vai funcionar. If you do that, it will work. So notice, for is from ir. Fizer is from fazer. The Spanish equivalents would be cuando vaya a Brasil, te llamaré. So vaya is here the present subjunctive. Si haces eso, funcionará. If you do that, it will work. So Spanish is using the present subjunctive or present indicative. Portuguese uses a distinct future subjunctive form. Spanish speakers must learn to expect this tense. Then we have the personal infinitive, which is unique to Portuguese. Portuguese allows the infinitive to agree with its subject. É melhor nos irmos agora. It's better that we go now. So you can see the infinitive ir, to go, is conjugated for we, irmos. Antes de eles chegarem, before they arrive. Again, the infinitive is chegar, and em is the conjugation for the third person plural. So conjugating the infinitive. So we see the infinitives change. Irmos, we go. Chegarem, it is they arrive. Spanish cannot do this. Spanish must use a subjunctive. Es mejor que vayamos ahora. It's better that we go now. Antes que lleguen, before they arrive. Portuguese often avoids a subordinate clause by using a personal infinitive instead. This is a major structural difference. Next, let's look at the object pronoun position. Spanish is very consistent. Me lo dio. He gave it to me, where lo is it. To me, it gave. Te lo dije. I told you. To you, it, I told. Pronouns come before the conjugated verb. They attach only to infinitives or commands, such as dármelo, give it to me. Brazilian Portuguese in speech looks similar. Ele me deu o livro. He gave me the book. Te falei isso. I told you that. But in written formal Portuguese, you may also see deu-me o livro. He gave me the book. Falou-me a verdade. He told me the truth. That is inclisicis, pronoun after the verb. Spanish almost never does this with conjugated verbs. At least I've never seen it. Spoken Brazilian Portuguese is closer to Spanish. Written Portuguese preserves the older clitic patterns in this case. Next, we have progressive versus simple present. In Spanish, one would say, estoy hablando, I am speaking. The Portuguese equivalent to this is estou falando, I am speaking. Structurally, they are identical, but usage differs slightly. Brazilian Portuguese uses the progressive more often for ongoing action. For example, estou trabalhando agora, I'm working now. Spanish often says, trabajo ahora, I work now, to have the same meaning. Spanish uses the simple present more broadly for present time actions. Portuguese leans more towards the gerund. Then we have the preterite versus present perfect. This is a critical difference. In Spanish, he comido, I have eaten. This tense is very common in Spanish, especially in Spain. Brazilian Portuguese behaves differently. Eu comi, I ate, just a simple past. So for a simple completed action, Brazilians prefer the simple past. Portuguese does have tenho comido, but this usually implies repetition or ongoing action. Tenho estudado muito ultimamente. I have been studying a lot lately. Tenho viajado bastante este ano. I have been traveling a lot this year. So the mapping is not one-to-one. In Spanish, he comido, simple, completed action. In Brazilian Portuguese, eu comi, default equivalent. The compound tense in Portuguese often signals repeated action rather than simple completion. And then we have existence, versus ten. Spanish uses haber for existence. Hay un problema. There is a problem. Había muchas personas. There were many people. Notice the verb is still conjugated in the singular form. Brazilian Portuguese splits this. In the spoken form, tem problema. There is a problem. Tem muitas pessoas aqui. There are many people here. In formal or written Portuguese, há problema. There is a problem. Havia muitas pessoas. There were many people. In everyday Brazilian speech, tem, third person singular of the verb ter, tener in Spanish, to have, is overwhelmingly used. Using a sounds formal or literary. Spanish always uses haber. Brazil separates spoken and formal usage. At the beginner level, Spanish and Portuguese feel extremely close. At intermediate level, grammar begins to diverge. At advanced level, these structural differences define fluency. The future subjunctive, the personal infinitive, and clitic placement, tense usage differences, existence with ten versus a. This is where using one language to learn the other requires real awareness, not just intuition. Then we have register and social tone. Beyond vocabulary and grammar, Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese differ in how they signal respect, distance, and social hierarchy. Both languages have formal forms, but they use them differently. Spanish maintains a clear structural contrast. Tu hablas, you speak, informal. Usted habla, you speak, formal. Using usted signals respect, social distance, professional hierarchy, politeness towards strangers. You can also refer respectfully in the third person. El señor quiere hablar con usted. The gentleman wants to speak to you. La señora necesita ayuda. The lady needs help. Switching from tú to usted changes tone immediately. In many parts of the Spanish-speaking world, this distinction is socially meaningful and actively maintained. Looking at formality in Brazilian Portuguese uses você fala, you speak. It's neutral every day. But você is not strongly formal. It's the default form in most of Brazil with friends, with co-workers, with strangers, service interactions, etc. For higher respect, Brazilian Portuguese uses the same third person as Spanish does. O senhor fala, you speak, formal, masculine. A senhora fala, you speak, formal, feminine. More examples. O senhor precisa de ajuda. Do you need help? It's formal to a man. A senhora deseja algo mais? Do you wish anything else? It's formal to a woman. So structurally, this resembles Spanish third-person politeness. But socially, it is used more narrowly. In Brazil, senhor, senhora is typically reserved for elderly people, very formal interactions, and situations requiring marked respect. It is not the everyday default. So the key difference in Spanish, ¿quieres café? Do you want coffee? Is informal. ¿Quiere café? Do you want coffee? Is formal. In Brazil, você quer café? Do you want coffee? Is neutral every day. O senhor quer café? Do you want coffee? It's formal in the case of a male. So again, você more or less equals tu in tone. Señor and señora more or less equals usted. If a Spanish speaker assumes você equals usted, they may misinterpret politeness levels. Understanding this difference prevents social misunderstandings. Then we have rhythm and prosody, why they sound different. If vocabulary explains why Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese look similar, rhythm explains why they sound different. This difference operates below grammar. It's phonological and perceptual. Spanish is syllable timed and vowel stable. Vowels do not disappear. That means each syllable carries similar weight. Vowels remain clear. Unstressed vowels do not disappear. Example, estoy hablando ahora. I am speaking now. Each syllable is clearly pronounced. Estoy hablando ahora. The rhythm is even. Estoy hablando ahora. Estoy hablando ahora. The rhythm is even. The vowels are stable. This gives Spanish a transparent, steady sound. In Brazilian Portuguese, there is greater stress. Brazilian Portuguese leans towards more stress time rhythm. That means stressed syllables stand out. Unstressed vowels reduce. Some syllables compress. Final consonants may vocalize. For example, estou falando agora often sounds closer to estou falando agora. Notice the O reduces to U. Unstressed vowels weaken. Stress creates a pulsing rhythm. The language flows in waves rather than evenly spaced syllables. And then we have vowel reduction in action. In Spanish, como mucho. Both vowels como are clearly pronounced. Como mucho. Como mucho. In Brazilian Portuguese, eu como muito often sounds closer to eu como muito. The O becomes U. Unstressed vowels weaken. The reduction reinforces stress contrast. And then there's nasal vowels and resonance. Brazilian Portuguese has phonetic nasal vowels. No, mão, hand, pão, bread. Spanish has no phonetic nasal vowels. This changes the acoustic texture of the language. To Spanish ears, nasal vowels add softness and resonance. To Portuguese ears, Spanish can sound sharper and more percussive. And then there's the final L vocalization. Brazilian Portuguese often vocalizes final L. Brazil sounds like Brasil, as I mentioned. Mal often sounds like mau. Spanish keeps the consonant clearly pronounced. This contributes to Portuguese sounding more fluid and less clipped at word endings. This leads to a common asymmetry. Spanish speakers tend to read Portuguese easily, but struggle with listening at natural speed. On the other hand, Portuguese speakers understand spoken Spanish quickly, but may over-reduce vowels when speaking Spanish. Visually, the languages align. Rhythmically, they diverge. And rhythm affects perception more deeply than vocabulary does. These two final layers, social register and rhythm, are what truly separate the languages once you move beyond basic grammar. Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese are close enough to accelerate each other, but they are different enough to demand respect. If you understand the vocabulary conversion patterns, the pronoun logic, the structural grammar differences, the social register, and the rhythm, you stop guessing. You stop blending them into one hybrid language, Portañol, and you start using one as a bridge to the other. They're not the same language, but they are powerful allies. And if you approach them systematically, one can become the fastest gateway to mastering the other. Thank you for listening and see you in the next video. If you would like to know more about my experience over the past 5 decades, learning and using more than 30 languages around the globe, with adventures in 101 countries so far, then please visit my website, polyglotdreams.com. There you will find my memoir, A Life in 30 Languages, translated in various languages and integrated with audio and dual readers to offer a great way to improve your target languages.